Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday instead of Thursday. I know we normally meet on a Thursday, but because it's a different type of show today, show sounds very showbiz. We're doing it on a different day, and today, obviously, the difference being we've got someone to talk to you all. So hopefully, one of a few that we'll do over the coming months. But this person, funnily enough, is rather unique in my sense, in that I actually bought one of his books many years ago, and got me started in some ways, in terms of learning different ways of taking images. And those books actually are still now as relevant today as they were at the time. And here's an interesting one. If you go through, I think, and I'm going to be really cruel about Joe's age now, but we can say that he started shooting for his books last century. So if you look at those books, you will find in there a lot of the things that people have now discovered in, where are we, 2021 or 2010 even, or whatever. Mr. Cornish was out already shooting several decades ago, and probably not discovering them, but certainly photographically making the most of them. So with that all said, let's bring Mr. Cornish in. So here he is, the finest man, Mr. Joe Cornish. Welcome.
Thanks, Paul.
So, as a bit of a, I guess, brief intro, I'm going to let you take the floor for a couple of seconds, if that's okay, just to describe where you are, I guess, from, where you're at, and the style of photography that you typically undertake, and then we'll basically open the floor. So, in terms of general session setup, the guys that are regularly on here will know. Feel free to put in comments and questions. We will try and answer as many as we can. We've got a load of questions that were sent in beforehand, some of which Joe has a theme of, some of them he has no idea. So we'll see how that goes, but feel free to put in your questions as you go, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. So with that said, Mr. Cornish, let us know who you are.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Well, first of all, great to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to chat to my contemporaries and friends. And it's always nice to be in the company of photographers, as far as I'm concerned. I'm from Exeter in Devon originally, and very briefly went to university in Reading, where I did a degree in fine art and became fascinated by photography, partly as you could say, as a sort of counterpoint to the art education I was getting at the time, which, although I greatly appreciate it now, I really struggled with at the time. Became obsessed with photography at college, went and worked and lived in America for 2 years, then lived in London for a further 11 years, firstly working as an assistant, then had a fairly good familiarity with the commercial world in London during that period. Failed to make any progress into that world, which I'm hugely grateful for, actually, because it led me to what I do today, which is basically, I think, well suited, hopefully, to my personality. Because I'm not one who likes being in the center of attention, or indeed at the center of a commercial shoot with a bunch of art directors and models and model makers and assistants and so on. I work mainly on my own out in the landscape, and I currently live in North Yorkshire. I'm sure I will continue to live in North Yorkshire, but have done so for the last nearly 30 years now. And it's been a great home for me, and a great base as well from which to do my own travels, which are primarily in the north of England and Scotland. But I also do, from time to time, I used to, at least up until 18 months ago, travel abroad. So that's me. And in terms of what I do, I photograph landscape mostly, but also architecture. I do teach quite a bit, lead a lot of workshops. I write, I give talks, and I suppose I'm happy to say I'm still a working photographer. I still do significant commissions. So as well as doing the books that, Paul, you've mentioned, which I write myself, I've also worked for other writers on book projects. I think we're going to probably discuss one of those later. And I've also been commissioned by the National Trust at Fountains Abbey to do two pieces of work for them over the last 2 years. One at Brimham Rocks, which is a sort of adjacent property for Fountains Abbey itself, which is a World Heritage Site. And then I have a major exhibition at Fountains Abbey next year in the summer. So great opportunity, great responsibility as well, but very much as a working photographer stroke artist, because essentially it's an artist in residence gig. That's it.
Nice. Yeah. So for everyone that thought photography shut down during COVID, clearly not, because Mr. Cornish has managed to make it continue working. So yeah, no excuses, people. Let's have a look at a couple of questions. Then we've got some of Joe's images as well, which we'll probably pull up with some of the questions in mind, because some of them are quite relevant, I guess. So a couple of the questions are quite themed. So we'll try and cover them as groups, so that you don't end up with a few of the same thing. But let's start with, just for fun, let's start with this one. So Instagram, love it or hate it. And in fact, let me preempt the challenge with that one, which is the expanded version of the same question. Potentially could be this one, which is: do you miss the good old days? I love it when people refer to that in quotes. Before everyone with a phone became a professional photographer.
No, but I do understand the sentiment, because I have had times when I massively miss the good old days. And I think it was a big challenge for me in the late 2000s, particularly. And I felt that you know what? I've never lost that love of being a photographer or taking pictures. But when there's no doubt that, especially when you're a large format film photographer, you had a certain skill and craft that couldn't be emulated any other way. So that put you in a strong position to be able to at least get work and feel that you had a voice in a particular field. Now it's obviously much harder to do that. But the reason I would say that I don't miss those days is because I do believe in progress. I do. In a way, what the analogy I would use about this is that the phone today has become essentially plural education in literature, reading and writing. It's photography for everyone. And I think, to me, that's a good thing. I mean, clearly photography can be used for good or ill, as all other means of human communication can. But I hope that we represent a way of using photography that's a gift to humanity, and is a positive for society at large. And so, in that respect, I think the more people can enjoy and appreciate using a camera, and also looking at photographs and trying to understand more about the human condition as a result, then to me that's a real positive thing, that it has become so universal, which it is now.
I guess the fun one for me is, because I hear this quite a lot, in fact, the next question I'll just pull up, because it's along a similar line. Do you think it's harder or easier to establish yourself as a professional photographer these days compared to when you started out? And I guess the challenge is for everyone that says, iPhones have ruined the profession, blah blah blah. I take more pictures on my iPhone than I do on my big camera. I'm pretty sure you probably do. We all do. So actually, we're all using that technology. So it's not really a case of A or B. It's A and B to that extent.
So exactly. So I think it would be hypocritical to criticize the phone or the phone manufacturers. The phone manufacturers have actually done more to transform photography than all the camera manufacturers put together. Ironically. Now, whether how much of a good thing, or whether it's really improved photography, is perhaps a debate for another time. But the way I would see it is the same as if we return to the reading and writing aspect. If you are a writer, it's still really, really hard to make a living in the UK, for example. It's just to take a Western nation at the moment. And I'm sure that would be true in most other Western democracies. It's hard to make a living as a writer, but you can make a living as a writer. And some people do make a lot of money doing it if they're successful with novels, let's say, or in whatever field. And the same is true in photography. You can still make a living as a photographer. It is very hard to make a good living, frankly. In the days when I was an assistant 40 years ago, the guys I assisted, were seriously wealthy. They were wealthier than footballers of their day. Admittedly, that would be different today. Um, but and there are still a few big name photographers who do extremely well. But the fact is, it is still possible to make a living at it. But you have to work very, very hard at it, and you have to find perhaps unique and new channels. And that is what the younger generation, and Paul, I think I could probably include you in that,
Just,
maybe,
yeah.
are able to, to use different skills. And I'm thinking in particular of filmmaking, because, whether it's using a drone, being able to mix music and film editing and so on, which you need to do video in order to sell your own product as a photographer. I'm very happy to say that I don't do that, because I don't know. I think I'm still struggling to just try to improve my stills photography, frankly. I don't see that ever ending. So I feel it, for me, it would be a distraction, but I'm very impressed by how a number of the younger generation are carving a new way of making a living for themselves in our area.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I mean, books. I mean, we'll come on to the book stuff a little bit later, but one thing that I have seen, the photographers that tended to, I guess, do a little bit or fare a bit better through the recent storm, as it were, had passive income as well, in part. So, for example, in fact, one of the questions, where are we? Let's pull up. In fact, I'm not going to pull up the question first, but there is Joe's gallery in all its glory up in North Allerton, I think, up in the nosebleed section of the country, as I see from my coastal town. But in there, you don't just have your work in there. You've got local artists, you've got local food producers and whatever else. So I guess part of that is as a photographer nowadays, it's not just a case of I click the button and I sell my prints times a million. There are other ways to add into that income stream in general, I guess.
Yes, I mean, to be fair, the gallery is. I mean, what I'm most proud of about the gallery is the fact that we employ people, and and it's a nice place to work and a lovely place to visit, and we also give a shop window to other photographers. And we also stand as a place where hopefully people will get inspiration from and about nature, and we'll discuss nature and its value to us, because I see that as the role of landscape and nature photographers, to provide a form of meditative focus on that. So as to the business side of it, I mean, as you can see, Paul, I continue to work as a photographer because, frankly, it would be difficult to rely on the gallery, which because it's not the most profitable type of business, but it's a lovely thing to do, and I must say that actually the creative side of it has been very rewarding for me, and particularly the community side, and that's what I really, really, really appreciate. So I don't know if that answered a question at all, but
no, it does. Yeah. So
it's
in
different.
fact, go on, Joe.
Well, I was just thinking back to the the question of making a living today, and the different ways that there are numerous ways of doing it, and there are still commercial opportunities as well. But most of all, I think that what I've always tried to do, and I think this is more true than ever, is to try to combine the things that you love to do and that your personal strengths, and to develop a career which you can do as somebody who's self-employed, and pursue those paths. But you have to have that passion and commitment for the subject matter, as well as, in the case of photography, the process of making photographs. And I think if you're able to combine those things, then you can still have a good career as a photographer.
Yeah. And then, so on that point with the gallery, let's go back to a fun one. So how has COVID affected the gallery? Well, I can guess that one, because I'm guessing you were shut for a little while. But then the wider point, and this person had asked, when it comes to NFTs, we're not going to go into the whole NFT debate, because that's a fun one on its own. But as we can see, the world is switching to the option of a more virtual environment. I guess, with your gallery, how does that feel to you? as it approaches, I guess.
Um, yeah, I don't well, things in the world of economics, all businesses are affected by the ebbs and flows of technology. We have to accept that. After all, 40 years ago, however many thousands, tens of thousands of Brits were employed down coal mines. Now there's none.
Yeah,
And people have had to retrain and do other things. And I think that, I always try to see the positive. I mean, if we can't make a future of it, then we can't. But at the moment, we still have a lot of positivity. We're still having customers coming through the door. And it will be easier if we get to the point where people feel more confident. Now, it's the main problem at the moment is, although we're reopened, confidence among many of our customers to revisit is lower than it was, clearly.
sure.
So that's a bit of a problem. In terms of the alternative technologies, I'm always happy to see progress, and I think that you could argue that these are new technologies and new opportunities for stills photographers. So that's something to be welcomed. As you know, Paul, I don't really know the mechanism of an NFT, and I've got no expectation or intention of going there. I just like making prints, actually, physical prints, and I do believe in the physical experience of the print and the fact that, after all, when you make a print, you put it in a given space. Okay, the reflected light can be significant, but essentially you've made a statement. The color and the tones and the detail and so on at that point are fixed. Whereas on a screen, you send it off onto the internet, it's going on somebody else's device. It might look the same, but it quite likely won't. So
Probably won't.
it's
Yeah,
a bit of it is a virtual experience in more ways than one. So not 100% satisfactory in that regard. Whereas, and also the one other thing is that I do see a print has a certain kind of to me, a very appealing permanence. And I mean, nothing is permanent on planet Earth, but at least in terms of generations of humans, it's much more likely that when I drop off the perch, that my kids will discover the prints and think, "Oh, let's hang on to one or two of Dad's prints." Are they going to hang on to the hard drives? I don't think so.
yeah.
So there's
Well,
something about
I
that
mean,
that's appealing.
well, it is the fun one that you said I'm in the younger generation. I tell you, the other day, I realised, because someone actually said it, there are kids now, and as in people that are old enough to serve you in a bar, who have never seen a CD, not a tape, not a cassette, but a CD. And we're in that place where, I remember when a floppy, or the virtual world of this is going to be stored on a floppy disk forever. No, it's not. I couldn't find one floppy disk I used to own. And to your point, yes, in theory, this stuff has permanence, but I'm pretty sure I can still pick up the book or flip through it rather than trying to find some random file somewhere. So yeah, it is different. So technical question from one of the guys that's online. So M Chums, not sure who M is. Could be, well, I don't know. We're not even going to guess. It could be a million names. So you use digital medium format sensor. Yes. The difference between 4x5 and 8x10. Because, and actually, in terms of your journey with this, Joe, you pretty much specialized in technical cameras and tilt mechanisms and so on. And then you switched across to, was it a P45 originally, or maybe even different to that? But so you were actually on digital medium format from pretty early on in the game.
To be honest, Paul, that was the only way I was going to change. So I love I still love 5.4 as a medium to shoot, and 10.8. Although I have to be honest with you, I've barely ever shot 10.8 out in the landscape, only ever in the studio. So 5.4, I still think it's a great way to shoot, but I felt that I had to learn digital. There was so much, you cannot hold back the tide of progress. But my feeling was I wanted to transition using a technical camera, and actually that's still what I do. So although for a while I had a digital medium format back on an Ebony,
Right.
not a very satisfactory arrangement. But as soon as it became available, I bought a Linhof Techno, which for those who are not familiar is a medium format specific technical camera. It's a so-called non-folding baseboard camera with a triple extension. It's actually I bought the first one that came into the country, I think, from Paula, and I've still got it today, and it's still my main camera I've used. So I've had it for 12 years, and it hasn't changed. Of course, it's had one or two repairs, and that's it. And I have changed backs, I will admit. I'm very, very happy about that because the latest back is absolutely amazing. The older backs were difficult to work with. And actually, the worst thing about it in the transition was that you felt that you were kind of taking a big step backwards because of the operational difficulties of working virtually blind, because the ground glass
you had
screen,
no preview.
Well, you went from that size to effectively, to that sort of size, which in ground glass terms for somebody who was at the time just what was I? Yeah, just gone 50. My eyesight wasn't getting any better. And anyway, so now I have a very convincing live view, focus peaking, and so on. In terms of this is a really interesting question, though. What are the differences? I mean, there are differences out in the field clearly about how the cameras work and are used. And then when it comes to the pictures that I make today, if I make a calendar, which I do every year, I use my archive and I use my current work. And the only thing that's so there's older images and there are newer images, and I always process them with the expectation it's all my work. Can you see the difference? You shouldn't really be able to, other than that maybe there are some stylistic differences that are much more to do with my aging process, and also my changing philosophy in what I believe about nature. That's one of the reasons that digital raw files are great, is that you do have a tremendous higher degree of flexibility than you did with a color transparency.
Because actually, I'm just going to pull up on the screen, Joe, so people can see. So this is one of your pretty old images now. Actually, I think from memory, it's been around for a long time, and this was presumably on your original ebony setup of some sort.
Yes, yeah, shot in 2001, I think.
Right, and then so that was from back there, and then this is obviously much more recent. The style is similar. The techniques you're using are similar. And we can talk about the tilt bit in a second. But, what I've seen in the images, certainly the ones that you sent across, they have the same feeling regardless of camera technology you've had on the back of it, as it were.
Yeah, I hope so, because essentially it's still a response to nature as I experience it, and an exploration of the process, of the photographic process. And actually, even when I was at uni, before I even used a camera seriously, if that's the right term, because it's all play in a way, the idea of depth has been central to my work, spatial depth, and trying to find ways of describing that in a really interesting way. So so to an extent, a technical camera with tilt is a very natural way of working for me, because of the fact you can manipulate the plane of focus. You can make it go the other way too, if you don't want things to be in focus. But that's nowadays that sort of process is usually accomplished for most people, focus stacking. But this can be done with one exposure, working with tilt, which I think is clearly an advantage in a lot of cases. And the other thing is,
well, I was going to say this is a perfect example of when we talk about focus stacking, we start introducing challenges, and one of the things that's unique, well, not unique, but certainly very central to the way that Joe shoots, is the use of tilt in images to get the focal plane off of just effectively straight across. So whereas a lot of people would look at this image, for example, and think, okay, well, actually, if I want I don't know how close that pool is in the front, but it's looking like your feet are going to get wet. So that depth of field throughout, and to keep it relatively sharp throughout the whole image, nowadays we'd automatically switch to being a focus stack, but actually, A, you don't have to, and B, this has been possible for years and years. Back to beyond film sort of thing, and it's one of the signature things that you use to produce the images and the way that they come out.
So yeah, just a little bit of photographic history for anybody who's interested. But the tilting mechanism on cameras, it really dates back to as I understand it, to the First World War, when a German survey engineer called Scheinflug discovered that he could control he could get everything sharp front to back from an elevated position with a very, very large camera looking out towards enemy lines, by tilting the camera. So hence the Scheinflug principle, if anybody is a large format photographer, which it still holds just the same today. And you're right about preceding film, because he used glass plates, so which were in common use up until the 1920s, I believe, as a technology, and of course gave great quality because of the absolute flatness of glass compared to film. In many ways, it's a slightly superior medium, but just hopelessly impractical by comparison. So yeah, that's actually one way that I quite like to compare shooting on film 5x4 or 10x8 with shooting with a Phase 1 or a Fuji or whatever, is that the digital cameras have absolutely flat focusing plane devices, which of course isn't always ideal for lenses, which really struggle to focus everything in a completely flat plane. But that's the idea anyway. Whereas film, by its very nature, is never completely flat. It always has a little bit of curvature in the gate of the film. So, which is not to say you can't make sharp pictures with film. Obviously, you can, but it is not as precise a process. So,
Sure.
just to try to, if I may, to just finish that technical question about feel. I think the feel comes from the photographer, but the technical limitations of let's say of digital large medium formats are such that I think you can make a reasonable comparison between 150 megapixel back and well focused 5x4 transparency or negative, and that they are very, very close in practice. But there'll always be people who are fans of one or the other who want to debate it forever, and that will go on forever. But I can tell you, as somebody who prints a lot, that medium format, even with the lower resolution sensors of early days, you can make beautiful large prints with from a large format or medium format sensor, because the signal quality is very, very good. And digital files, essentially, if the lenses are good, will produce very, very fine detail at print level up to as big as you need to generally. So I think that there is a romance about shooting 5.4 or 10.8 for sure, and there's a performance aspect to it today. So if you go out with a big film camera, people will always be intrigued and want to come up and talk to you and all of that, which
especially
is cool.
once you get the cloak on.
But I still use that, by the way. I mean,
to see the digital back.
Well, yeah. You know what I've started doing recently? This is a little tip for anybody else who's not thought of it. But I carry a disposable umbrella with me at all times, or not disposable, but because I don't certainly keep them, not dispose of them, but a mini umbrella, collapsible, I should say. And the reason is that it's useful for three things. One is when you want to see the image with no reflection behind you. The other is if you want to which works whichever way the light is. Sometimes you'll end up putting it down over the camera itself. You're looking at the playback or looking at live view. And it also works as a distant flag, French flag. So if you're shooting close to the sun but not into the sun, you can hold an umbrella quite a way away from the lens. And with live view, see that you're not in the picture with the brolly, but it keeps the sun out of the lens. Nice. So it's a good tip of the day. There you go.
There you go. Pack an umbrella, just not a silver one.
Black.
So, yeah, black one ideally. I just realised I was talking about poppies and we didn't actually put the shot on the screen. So yeah, my fault. Sorry. But yeah, so if we look at these two, they were taken literally decades apart, but that technique is the same. It's about getting the entire frame in focus and almost giving the viewer something that they wouldn't actually be able to see, I guess, with their own eyes to a certain extent.
So, yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, because I suppose you could argue that the way the brain works, it maps the world in front of us according to the fovea, and because it processes everything so fast, we have an impression, at least, that everything is in focus in our peripheral vision, whereas in fact it isn't. So, yeah, it's a kind of, I suppose you could say it's a debatable point. But what is true is that when you have a tilting camera, you're encouraged to think about compositions like this, because there's a certain pleasure in solving the problem. I mean, this was shot with a wide angle lens, 40 millimeter. The preceding one was with a 50, and the one before that was actually a 300, the blue and gold. So it works with all different lenses. That's the other thing. And this is one way in which the technical camera is actually quite good value. You can get relatively cheap lenses, some of them older, and they just mount in a cheap flat panel, and they fit on the technical camera, and a camera does all of the work, the rise and fall, the tilt, the swing, and so on. So it's actually quite an affordable way. The difficult part is the digital back, although there are now relatively inexpensive phase one back secondhand, as we know, but even so, it's not cheap. But there are many solutions, and my feeling is that the most important thing is actually not the camera at all. It's the state of mind you bring to the subject matter, and your perception of light and form. Those are the things that really matter. The camera is inherently becomes part of our process, but the most important thing is the feeling for the pictures that you want to make and what story you're telling with them.
So we'll come back to the feeling, because there's a couple of specific questions about that one. So we'll come back to that in a second. David's just said, there you go, he's been to Joe's gallery a few times. Lovely place to visit. And not just, unfortunately, Joe, not just for your work, but for local artists as well. So
no, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really important. It saddens me that there are so few photography galleries in our country, but I can understand why that's the case, because the economics don't make a lot of sense, really. But if you want to see our medium thriving, I think seeing prints is I still think that's the kind of, it's the high point of what we do, and books too, by the way. I think a book is a wonderful way to experience photography, for sure.
And so, as I say, just before we go on to the shooting style thing, so we talked about your setup. So, ideally, technical camera, a very composed approach to it, thinking through what that composition is going to be, maybe taking some time. So, let's talk about the amount of time you took to take that photo before anything went wrong.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I'm sure that you've been on ships, Paul. I'm sure
I've been out there.
Yeah, so it's. When you're on a ship, it's not a lot of point using a tripod. I mean, you can do in theory in certain circumstances, but the vibration is usually a bit of an issue. So mostly when we're shooting from a ship, everything's changing because you're moving through space. It's a very different experience to using a tripod, and you have to be ready. And I love that aspect of it because it's a new challenge. So just to put this into perspective, this amazing Archberg is deep in a fjord system in East Greenland, one of the most truly amazingly spectacular places left on planet Earth, still almost completely unpopulated. The ship is moving about, I have to give a guess, about 70 meters to the east side of the berg, and we're moving probably 4 miles per hour or thereabouts, so relatively gently, but there's no moment that's exactly the same. Sure. So you've got to select. And I was using a Sony A7R2, very good camera, but relatively old now, with a very rotten buffer. So if you shoot RAW files, you can't, there's no point keeping your finger on the shutter.
You're not going to click away.
no, you've got to choose your moments. So this was my, I have a series here, so there's probably about 8, 9, 10 exposures. But you can see as that happens that we're moving past, the shape of the arch is changing and so on. So, but the central idea is the same. The focal length is roughly the same. It's roughly shot with a zoom, but I think at a sort of standard focal length, more or less. And about 10 seconds after this photograph was made, we're moving from, I hope you're seeing this right, but that way.
Yeah.
So it's getting narrower because if you think of it still, or the
it's
arch is getting
converging.
narrower.
Yeah.
Exactly. And 10 seconds after that picture was made, the arch collapsed. And it did so in this, I mean, it was a true, if I use the term sublime, I hope you'll know that that's meant in the
Yeah.
traditional sense of the word, as in awesome, terrifying, and beautiful.
Yeah.
From the 18th century, I think. I'm trying to remember the name of the philosopher who coined it, Burke, I think, possibly. But anyway, and in that moment, the arch collapsed. There was these huge shards of ice but were projected essentially up and down the fjord. So we were protected by the nearer pillar of
Right.
the berg, which
Wow.
held up, and so we were safe. But I mean, if we'd been, as it were, side
A
onto it,
bit too further. Yeah.
we'd have been showered with ice. So you're obliged by shipping regulations to avoid getting too close to icebergs, and that was a very fascinating demonstration of why. Anyway, so yeah,
No,
what very
I've
very
been out in
amazing
Disco Bay
experience.
in the same sort of setup with out on a boat and seen what I thought at the time, as you say, was awesome, incredible, amazing, because this huge bit of ice has fallen down. And then I looked at the ship's captain, who was not looking like it was awesome and incredible. He was looking like he needed to speed up.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's right. Because they've got to be on their guard the whole time. So we ended up. It may be different. Maybe you could have run away from it or escaped. So it depends where you are. But we had to turn towards the berg really sharp and hard because there was a shockwave that came away, and if we'd been caught side on, it could have been not
yeah.
catastrophic probably because it wasn't big enough, but if it had been a huge berg, yes, you could have had a capsize theoretically, or at least everything would have gone flying, which would not have been good,
No.
including possibly people out on deck, more to the point. So it's one thing for the boats are incredibly stable, and they will but people who are not experienced sailors up on deck with their cameras could be at risk. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And same location, but I mean, this is all sorts of incredible as a photo. So
Thank you.
slightly calmer, presumably, as a time to shoot. But again, was this Sony or was this on your technical camera?
This is Sony, yes, as well. I mean, it would be wonderful to have been able to shoot it with a Phase One, but wasn't. In fact, one of my fellow companions, Bob Conway, was using his Phase One XF with a 150 back at the time. So and his pictures are just incredible. I mean, the color particularly is even better. I mean, Sony's done a great job here, I would say. But I mean, more to the point, that was a sublime experience in the perhaps more modern iteration of the word because of its beauty. And we had a morning without going into long detail about it. It was absolutely dead flat calm. And after it was very soft light with lots of cloud and just gradually started to break. And by then we were out on the fjord in zodiacs. So as you can probably tell, because this is shot from very close, very, very
Yeah.
close to this small chunk of ice. I mean, in some ways there is a kind of, well, not really a message, but a narrative here, which is that these eroding icebergs, which of course there's literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of icebergs in Greenland, in the base in Greenland, and they're all decaying over time, which is what icebergs have always done. But in the not too distant past, there would have been glaciers coming down that distant valley, which have now retreated.
Mm,
So there is the rapid disappearance of glaciers in Greenland just is ongoing, as it is everywhere
yeah.
else in the world. And so there is changes are coming to everywhere, but especially in the Arctic, where temperatures are rising faster than elsewhere in the world. So you do wonder what that means for future generations in terms of their travel and photographic opportunities. But I just feel incredibly fortunate to have seen
Yeah.
such beauty. I really do.
Titan's just asked, what lens were you shooting for that photo? If you can remember, I'm guessing it was wide.
I can. Well, I can. Yes, you're right on both counts. I think it might have been 24. It was certainly on the 24 to 70 zoom, or it might have been just a bit further forward, maybe around 27, 28. But there or thereabouts. And actually, I use this picture sometimes as an example to show, let's not panic about depth of field. Why? Because if you look carefully, it's focused on the ice in the foreground. And if you scrutinize the file at 100%, you look at the mountain, you can see that the mountain is not razor sharp. But does that matter? No,
Yeah.
it really, really doesn't. I mean, in most field situations, in most situations, I would say, when you make a normal size print, I have printed this image. It works perfectly. Just shot, and actually, it's not even shot at f11; it's at f8 because I was balancing, as you do, between not wanting to raise the ISO, keeping still, and shooting at 2/50th of a second or something. Which actually, that's usually the biggest priority, because with the best will in the world, you do need to keep the shutter speeds quite high if you want to achieve fine detail. Because these sensors are very unforgiving in that regard. They will show you if you're not perfectly sharp. So yeah, manual focus, a medium aperture, and focus on the foreground. And certainly with the wide angle lenses, the background pretty much takes care of itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, nice. There's been a couple questions about the style of, did you pull out shadows and post processing and so on. It sort of comes on to this question, which is, how has editing software affected the way that you produce images now? I mean, obviously, when you were starting out, National Trust world and whatever, things like Capture One and Lightroom weren't around. It was, who would have put a photograph in a Lightroom? That would be stupid. You used a darkroom. Now we're in a very different world. So how has that changed, if it has actually, the way you approach an image?
Well, the answer is it has changed it. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a massive change for the better. And the reason I say that is because although I feel my work has always been concerned with what I regard as the eyewitness experience, and I can talk about that for years if you want, but maybe not the moment now. But I'm quite devoted to the idea of photography as as a eyewitness process. That it's a document of record. And I really feel quite strongly that, I mean, I don't mind what other people do, but for me, I want to be able to continue seeing it as a geographic process. Now, you could say, well, if you look back at my earlier work, shot with various different Kodak and mainly Fuji films later on, that they depart from that ideal quite a bit. There's a simple reason for that. Is they're shot with high contrast films that make landscape look great. Fuji Velvia, Fuji Provia, great films, and they were great for a young photographer setting out, trying to make pictures with reasonably high impact. Let's say that would compete on, let's say, magazine shelves. We were always being asked for pictures that were punchy, that would
grab
Annie
attention.
Liebert. Yeah, well, yes. And the classic example always given was that Annie Leibovitz became a very successful photographer, and she did all the Rolling Stone, was it Rolling Stone, the magazine, covers for a long time, and they were printed on recycled paper, and she developed a technique to create high impact color even on crappy paper.
Because it
And
was
so
old and worn.
Yeah, exactly. And so we, that was a kind of form of inspiration. But we didn't have that problem in a way, because we had often very glossy finished papers to print on. But we obviously didn't do the printing. We just had to produce a transparency that had good impact, good detail, and good color. But nobody really questioned the color. We just accepted the signature, as I see it now, of the film. So the film, it's like shooting a print. It's like shooting something that's finished. or shooting a JPEG is often the analogy that's given digitally. So if you shoot a JPEG, you can still move the color around, but you just can't do nearly as much with it as you can with a raw file.
Sure.
And what one of the I've over the last 20 years, my work has changed a lot. Now, at least it may not have changed in underlying philosophy, but I have so much more control now of the look of the picture because I'm shooting on a raw file. And on the whole, what I'm still trying to do is connect my pictures with the reality of my own lived experience out in the landscape. Only I think I'm much closer now than I was when I shot film. And
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that I'm not editing and translating and interpreting. I absolutely still am. The most important thing is that the picture itself lives. And that is not the same as it being the absolute eyewitness. Nobody knows
Yeah.
absolutely for sure what you saw. They can't. You have to be convinced in your own mind. You use a mixture of what you believe you saw, what you remember seeing, and then that's mixed in with your own emotional response or how you might see the story of that picture working, which is to say, cool, warm,
Mm.
dark, light. We use those two polar opposites: warm or cool, dark or light, or perfectly balanced somewhere in the middle. And then texture. You can make things softer. You can make things harder. You can have more grip. You can make them smoother. I mean, there's just endless different ways that the controls allow you to provide what I regard as subtle translations, which then ultimately become your own personal interpretation. And so for me, the idea that you look at that picture and the person who looks at it would also be able to recognize it very closely from if they stood next to you at the time,
Yeah.
that's still important to me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
has it affected the way I produce pictures? Yes, absolutely. And I would also say that my own style has become probably more reserved in terms of color and impact, because I actually want the landscape itself to do all the heavy lifting. I don't want to
Right.
impose my views on it. I actually think the beauty and the power of nature are inherent. And all it takes really for us as artists is to be there,
Yeah.
and to find a way of framing it to communicate those ideas and feelings, which isn't easy. I still
Sure.
think that's a big part of the process. But then with the post production, I want to retain that sense. But often, in spite of everything I've said, you might think, well, that should be easy. 3 or 4 minutes of editing and it's done. But it isn't. It's often a lot more than that.
Sure. I have there's a quick technical one, which we'll go through because I want to come back to that point that you just said about the feeling when you're there, because there's a few questions on that that a couple of people have got. But Keith's online now is just saying, do you tend to use a geared ball head on your tripod? He's saying it's the most significant piece of gear that's improved its composition.
Thanks, Keith. Yes, I completely agree with that. I think that geared heads have been a huge innovation for landscape photographers. I mean, they appeared. The first one I was aware of was a Manfrotto 410, which I think is still extant. In fact, I must admit that I now own proud owner of an Arca Swiss Cube, which I've had for about 5 years, and I've never regretted for a second spending the absurd amount of money that they cost, because it's so wonderful to use. It's so precise, but it's also relatively quick. And that sense of fine control, which I'm sure Keith is alluding to. I don't know what you use, Paul, but I imagine something similar. But everybody's
I've
different.
literally got a mix. I have,
Yeah.
and it depends on the scenario. So, take for example, we just picked up your Greenland shots. For me, a fluid ball head instantly, because if I'm going to be shooting stuff that's moving, and I have shot randomly with a tripod from a boat, it is possible. It's not great, but it saves your arm from hurting.
Mm.
But then speed is more important. Whereas if you're going to be stitching or anything like that, then that accuracy is the key. So it's sort of a horses for courses. But with the style of photography that you specialize in specifically, I can't imagine many times when you're desperate for speed when it comes to flipping where the camera's looking.
You'd be surprised how quickly the light can change. I know you know that. Yeah, but no, I agree. I mean, on the whole, that's true. And I mean, I know from my own experience of other people who've subsequently bought Arca Swiss cubes, having seen me use one, and not one of them has ever regretted it. Not that there aren't other excellent heads, there are, but
Yeah.
for me, that's an ideal one. The D4, the Arca Swiss D4, is very popular as well, and it's very, very good. And then Benro, I think, make a very, very good version of the Manfrotto 410, which I often recommend. If somebody's on a budget, that's an excellent alternative.
Okay, so going back to the thing, there were a couple of questions. Then I want to touch on the book stuff that you mentioned earlier. But one of them, this is quite well, it's a fun one, I guess. So your work spans a variety of iconic landscapes as well as industrial in the landscape. Are you using the same eye when you approach those two different areas or genres or whatever, or do you have a different way of approaching them based on what you're shooting?
I think that's I really applaud that question because it's insightful, and I think the reality is that I'm simply unable to adapt. I have my way of seeing, and I'm always looking for balance, for form, for mood, for atmosphere, for beauty, even if it's industrial. And I try not to make judgments. It's just the world. Picture making for me is about trying to reveal the subject in a way that makes sense for me. So yeah, it doesn't matter what the subject is. My approach is more or less the same. It might look different, but that's more likely to do with the subject than to do with my approach to it, I think.
Cool. And actually, it's interesting. So it's funny, isn't it? A lot of people, when they're asked, not necessarily the same question, but along those lines, our temptation as photographers is to say that we're ultimately flexible. We can shoot anything. Of course, we can do that and whatever. And it tends to be, once you stop trying to be, we used to use the phrase, jack of all trades, as it were, and just hone in on a style, an approach that works for you, the results tend to be better. And it may mean that you then discard certain, I guess, subjects and so on, but it means that your style starts to progress. Rather than just trying to hit every box, as it were.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
well, very briefly, just say that if I could summarize what I do, and I'm not sure that this responds to what you just said, Paul, but to me, it's all about relationships, and that's true. You know, occasionally I get invited to weddings, and I don't mind taking your picture when I'm there. I'm still looking at the picture as relationships. So I see figures chatting together in a social event. I'm still looking at negative space. And I'm looking at body language as well. But in a way, there is body language in the woods. You know, in a way, there's no separation. Everything's related to everything else. So you know, if you think of it in terms of a kind of visual philosophy or an artistic philosophy, it's the relationship between things, and that's it in every respect: light, form, color, line, shape, texture, etc., and so on. And ultimately, all I can do is make a picture that gives me pleasure or joy, or challenges me sometimes. But it's usually will have a. I'm not saying that as my style. I couldn't even tell you what that was, but for some reason they seem to come out looking slightly similar. I don't know.
They look
anyway,
good. Don't change it. So now I know this one's a fun one because it's a very long one, but actually I'm including it because I love actually how honest the question is, and I know that you'll answer it honestly as well. The text is going to be very small, so for those that can have the time to read it, I'll read it out anyway. So Joe often talks at length about the emotion that an image evokes, means, and represents, as you just alluded to there. Is this something that happens before or during the image capture, or post-capture, maybe during post-processing? I take pictures of things and I think look interesting or pretty, but don't really feel an emotion from the image, other than being pleased and relieved that I've done a decent job of capturing the image, or disappointed when I haven't done it justice. If I'm asked why I took a picture, it's because I found the subject interesting. I don't know why. It's no deeper meaning for me than that. It doesn't represent anything deeper to me. So I'm wondering whether this is partly down to Joe's background as a fine arts graduate versus me as an engineer, or is it more fundamental? There's a question.
Oh, that's quite a long question. Uh, yeah, I think there's the question of responses and meaning. I think meaning is ultimately is almost always reflective. So I think when you go out with your camera, you're usually trying to solve visual puzzles. That's the primary um, pleasure of it. Let's say you may be carrying baggage with you on the day. That happens. We go out with a particular mood or idea, or sometimes feeling hurt, sometimes feeling elated. Um, Strangely enough, when you feel elated, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to produce great photos. Sometimes you're feeling reflective, but you take your life with you. You take your whole experience with you. Indeed, I think that's very important. As I say, I really think when you're confronted by a scene, you are affected by everything else you've seen. Other pictures, other paintings, or any form of art that's influenced how you see. I mean, for me, I would say I get just as much compositionally and ideas-wise from 20th century painting as I have done from contemporary photography, let's say, in terms of ideas. And I'm always really, really excited by things I've not photographed before out in nature. And it's hard to say what that would be, but that excitement is something I think that does come across when, well, I hope it does at least, in some of the pictures. And I would, that, as to whether that amounts to meaning, I think it's just to do with that personal exploration, continuing to explore, to look at the world, and feel joy or connection to it. I don't think it's surprising that we see so many people out with or without cameras today, and certainly in our area. Whenever I take my camera, I see lots of people walking, and most of them are not taking pictures. Why are they out there? Because it gives them solace. It gives them a sense of well-being to be out in nature. So I think that's all the meaning that you actually need. Now, when you look at things like evolutionary biology, and humans and the history of human society and culture, you can start to then understand why it might actually really matter that we go out and look at the world on a regular basis and observe. In our case, that's photographers. The growth and death of plants and animals as part of our lived experience. It helps us feel part of the cycles of life. I actually genuinely think it is meaningful. There is a philosophical sort of element to it, and that is a common human. That's part of the human condition. I haven't prepared this speech beforehand, by the way. This is just completely off the top of my head. I just feel that photography allows us to do that. And I know a lot of engineers, by the way, who love taking photographs. And I also am conscious that for engineers, it can be difficult to make those associations, because I think photography is such a pleasurable excursion from the pressures of life and death that engineering does involve. Decisions you have to make as an engineer often have to follow a lot of rules and quite prescriptive ideas, because if you didn't do that, people would die. That's not the case in photography. And actually, part of the creative process is that we actually have this wonderful opportunity to experiment and take risks, make mistakes, get it wrong. Doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt anybody. And in the process of making mistakes, we learn as well. So, it's one of the things I feel is actually that makes this process very therapeutic for people who work so hard in civil society, keeping us safe, whether it's medics, doctors, nurses, and so on.
They can let go.
Absolutely, yes. So come and do more photography, and feel that you can. And most of all, it's the fact that it gives you a genuine excuse to be out in nature. And I just and an incentive as well. So if your pictures are great, of course that's really nice, but it doesn't matter that much. I have to say that. I think
it's the being out there.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I want to touch on, as we're sort of rapidly running out of time, but I just want to touch on your book. So obviously you mentioned you've got new stuff coming out this year and next. So you've been out and about, as it were, exploring, but this time into stately homes and ancient gardens and so on. So tell us what's. Well, I had to Google this. Not going to lie. Who's Humphry Repton?
Humphry Repton is an 18th-19th century landscape designer who succeeded, I think you could say, in the footsteps of Capability Brown, who may be a more familiar name to people watching, listening, and precedes, for anybody from the States, Frederick Law Olmsted. So in this field of landscape design, he is a major figure. And Johnny Phibbs, who wrote the book, attributes him with basically creating the vision of suburban England, for example, that we see today. Now, that might be a bit of a long shot, but I won't go into it. I'd rather encourage everybody to buy the book, because I think that it's a fascinating read. And I hope that the photographs will provide pleasure and joy as well, of course. Is it stately homes? Well, not really. Stately, I guess it depends what your definition of stately is. Most of these places, yeah, they are old. That's undeniable. They're big estates mostly. So, for example, the one that you've just seen, that would probably be 1,000 hectares. The folk who live there, lovely people who were very kind to me and who, probably struggle to just keep it all going, because it's expensive, and they're both academics. So other places, the owners have got different occupations. Some are very wealthy. Some make money from their estate, some from outside. It's not about them. It's about the past, actually, and trying to connect Repton and his ideas about managing land with the world that we see today. So Johnny's contribution is the narrative. Mine is the photography. And the photography is really intended as a parallel narrative. So the pictures not all these pictures are in the book, by the way. They're just more tend to be the ones that I really like that were made on. Well, you know what it's like.
I mentioned to you earlier, you've started taking a particular attention to tree bark and so on, which is great. Some of them are stunning. Like this thing, it must be hundreds, if not thousands, of years old.
Probably 300 or 400 years old for sure. Yeah, I mean, I've loved trees really all my life, and I've got paintings from when I was before I ever touched a camera of trees. So there's nothing, in a way, there's nothing new in this for me, other than that I've now found more ways of grouping them together in a meaningful fashion. One of the great things, by the way, about this opportunity because these are almost all private landscapes, privately owned landscapes in the UK. So it's an enormous privilege to have access to them. And many of them really do have fantastic ancient woodland in them, which is for me is a fantastic joy to be able to experience. A lot of them are parkland, some of them grazed, some agricultural. But they form a kind of unseen landscape within the UK, unseen by anybody except the owners and some of their local communities, clearly. So that was really special. I have sort of slightly mixed feelings about the idea of the amount of money and embedded privilege that there is tied up with all of these properties. But it's not for me to judge that. All I'm there to do is to do my best to try to translate what I see before me today. And then Johnny's narrative provides the kind of counterpoint and this fascinating history about Repton, the man.
So I've got one more live question, and I've got one that I'd like to finish on if we can. So this one's hopefully a quick one, but I love questions like this. How big is big enough when you print? There we go.
Yeah, so well, the biggest I can print is 44 inches wide by however long. I made a print for my recent exhibition, which was 72 inches by 40 in image area. So it's huge. It's not very practical for my personal portfolio. Hold on a second. I have a stash of boxes. It's A3 plus is what I do, and I actually think that for most purposes that's a really nice compromise. But saying that, you often think of, well, I don't know whether you do, Paul, but I think of Michael Kenner, one of the most successful photographers commercially in the art market in the world, actually. And I mean, I understand that all his prints are about 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches. So,
Yep.
they're very small, and people pay thousands for them.
Yeah.
For me, the print, I do think, though, having said that, my own style of photography, which is tends to be full of detail and often very, very complicated, complex compositions with lots and lots going on in them. Big prints are satisfying because you could get it so immersed
Yeah.
in the detail, and
Yeah. It
that's
feels more
part
like
of
you're
the.
there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just conscious of time. So one final question, which I actually accidentally put up earlier while you were talking about print size. But anyway, so finally, Mr. Joe Cornish, as the one of the esteemed landscape people in the UK, as someone, I think someone once described you as Joe doesn't take pictures; he goes out for a walk and explore, and happens to take a camera with him, which I quite like.
Oh, that's nice.
So in general, obviously, hopefully the world is going to open up a bit more freely. What do you think the challenges are going to be, especially in the landscape world? Obviously, parks are getting quite hit at the moment with visitor numbers and so on, but also there's presumably some pent up desire for travel and so on. So where's your head at in terms of what's likely to happen and what we need to do?
Yeah, no, it's well, we're faced by many dilemmas. I mean, the first of which is the question of climate change and habitat destruction, and whether our activities contribute to it directly or indirectly. And it's always been difficult for artists of any kind, I think, to this is actually, to be fair, this is the first time in history where it's become a real issue. I don't think that Ansel Adams worried about, when he got into his Cadillac station wagon, what sort of fuel he was putting into his car and things like
Sure.
that. And on the whole, most people would have probably applauded his legacy as being one that promotes the beauty of nature, and nature as a place of solace and reverence and so on. And in many ways, that remains the case. I think, and landscape photographers communicate a sense of the significance of the world, that it's something that we should care about. And there are many, many photographers who use landscape photography to communicate the destruction that's going on. I say many, probably not as many as there should be, but I think of Simon Norfolk, for example, great photographer who tends to go into war zones, mainly after they've been destroyed and adapted, and so it still makes absolutely wonderful photographs, which are full of beauty in the way that they're seen, but communicate a powerful message of destruction. But at the same time, for me, and remains true, I actually think that it's really, really important that artists convey hope and a feeling of beauty. Because if we don't have beauty in the world, then why are we here? To me, that's one of
Yeah.
the
What's the
most
point?
profound
Yeah.
questions that we face as human beings. So actually, although climate change is a huge issue, and by the way, my son is a climate scientist, so I have a little bit of direct interest in it from that point of view. But my personal preoccupation is habitat destruction and trying to preserve wilderness, for all. So our activities, I can't judge for others, but for myself, I have to question what I do through this lens. Is what I'm doing helping or hindering the
Sure.
process of supporting the idea of the preservation of the wild and the restoration of damaged lands? That's really important. I think there's more scope, in a way, for somebody like me living in the UK to campaign and advocate for restoration of landscapes, whereas I guess globally there are photographers living in other countries, be it Brazil, the US, for example, other places in South America and Africa and Asia, who could do valuable work to communicate the beauty and majesty and wonder of their wilderness landscapes, and advocate for their preservation forever and for future generations. And I think if we are to be relevant as landscape photographers, that is the challenge that confronts us.
Fair play. Big one. But we can go with
Sorry.
that. We can step by step. But no, I think I think it's fair. I think it's beholden upon us. And actually at a business level, professional landscape photographers, we earn an income from the ground and planet and places that we capture. We have a responsibility to look after those same things, not just for our own business, but actually bearing in mind we're the ones that are using them. So yeah, hopefully people will start to get the circle at some point, and they'll
I
start to
think,
stick.
yeah, exactly. And I think it also actually ultimately, if you have a sense of purpose, it tends to help to drive it. And I think, I know when I say a lot of things I just said, I feel a sort of sense of regret that I've not done as much as I could or should, perhaps in terms of campaigning. But I don't have that kind of personality. I feel that that each of us brings our own particular gifts and ideas to a situation. If we set ourselves goals of work that are worthwhile, it makes the process of continuing feel more worthwhile. I'm still really always excited to go out just locally with my camera and make pictures. But when I'm in a reflective mood and speaking with my family and friends, and or with you talking about these things, then I realize that this is what you set the question, and I'm trying to answer it really, and in a way that I believe is right. So whatever we can do, we should do. To be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Not the problem. Cool. On which happier note? So yeah, there we go. That was way over time. Sorry everyone that was on a bit of a tight schedule, but that said, that was very interesting. Thank you, Joe. So thank you to everyone that's been online. There's there's a few questions we didn't cover in there. So what I will try and do, some of them actually are quite themed, so I'll get back to people if necessary, but feel free to put stuff in comments and we'll try and cover those. I will put the details of the new book stuff, as well as Joe's gallery, Joe's site, and so on, and on landscape and so on, in the description of this. So for everyone that's watching later on, you can just click on that. But for now, thank you, Mr. Cornish. It's been a pleasure. Good to see you. Hopefully
Paul.
you can get
Thank you.
out and about as well as I can soon. But in the meantime, for everyone else and you, stay safe. Do what you're told, depending on which country you live in. And we will catch everyone for the normal editing sessions, as we do every week. But for now, if anyone gets the chance, pop in and say hi to Joe. He's up in his gallery. You've just got to drive a little way north or south, depending on where you are. And we will catch you, well, hopefully, around. If you see Joe on a mountain somewhere, don't interrupt him, because he's probably very accurately trying to control his Arca Swiss head. But other than that, he's probably out there quite just enjoying the outside, which is what everyone should be doing. So there we go. End of discussion. End of stream. Get outside. Go and take pictures, and have fun. Right. Cheers, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks, Paul.